Hi, Diane, and hi, Cindy. We're going to do this interview with the three of us to talk about the AMTEC project, history project. So I'm going to first put up the consent form. Are you guys seeing it?
Yes.
Yes,
Yep. And
Everybody?
I consent.
I
I
agree
consent.
without reservation, Chris.
Same with me, Chris.
Okay, and me too. And stop share. Okay, Cindy, would you like to start the session?
Sure. Sure. So welcome, everybody. This is just an opportunity for the three of us, Chris and Diane and myself, to have a conversation about our experiences of AMTEC, some of our memories, to help contextualize the history project that we've been working on and the interviews that we've done with other people so that you know a little bit about how this all came to be. And I guess I'll start just with my own introduction. My name is Cindy Ives. I'm a professor of distance education at Athabasca University. My initiation into AMTEC began in the early 1980s when I worked for the National Film Board in Saskatoon. And when I participated in media festivals as a distribution representative there. Later in my career, I worked at Laurentian University in Sudbury as a distance education developer. And I was reintroduced to AMTEC from the perspective of educational technology. And then later again, when I went to do my PhD at Concordia University, a PhD in educational technology, I became an AMTEC member again, related to the work that was being done by myself, but some of my colleagues and professors as well at Concordia. Since then, I have been involved in the Canadian Network for Innovation in Education, CNIE, and I am currently past president of that organization.
Thanks, Cindy. My name is Diane Janes, and I am currently a coordinator with CELT, which is the Center for Excellence in Learning and Teaching at Thompson Rivers University here in Kamloops, British Columbia. I started my work with AMTEC in the late 1980s, early 1990s, when my thesis supervisor, Dr. Mary Kennedy, introduced her graduate students to AMTEC and brought the AMTEC conference to St. John's, Newfoundland, where I was a student at Memorial University. That was my first introduction to an academic conference. It was my first introduction to AMTEC as an organization and to educational technology specialists, folks that really were interested in making educational technology part of their profession, part of their career. I left Memorial University and went to UBC, where I worked with Chris, which was awesome. And I had an opportunity to work with Dr. Tony Bates. And from there, my career moved from being an administrator to being a faculty member and everything in between. I got introduced to CJEC as a book review editor, as Mary Kennedy was then the editor. I currently co-edit the International Journal of E-Learning and Distance Education, which is part of the CNIE group of journals. And once I got to British Columbia and into Saskatchewan, which was my next post, I found myself oscillating between AMTEC and CADE, which was the Canadian Association of Distance Education. And when those two became CNIE, I served as past president of CNIE and also served on the AMTEC Trust as a co-chair. So, Chris, I think it's yours now.
Thanks, Diane. Yeah, so as Diane said, she and I had an opportunity to work with Tony Bates way back in the 90s, early 2000s with the Distance Education and Technology, D&T, Distance Education and Technology team. So I am just wrapping up a career at UBC in distance education, online learning. And I've had the opportunity to work with a lot of great people in distance education. I've been involved with AMTEC, and as well, I've participated in a lot of CADE conferences. So I was looking back at my time at AMTEC, and it actually kind of marks 30 years, because my first direct involvement with AMTEC was as a Commonwealth Relations Trust bursar in 1993. Where it was a visiting scholarship to the United Kingdom. So it's funny that I know AMTEC's having its 50th anniversary as well. So I've been part of that for 30 years anyway. So it's kind of strange. So I've been involved. So that was my first involvement. Then I got persuaded by Gary Carlson, who we interviewed as part of this series, to participate in the board. I guess he kind of guilted me into it because I had gone on as a bursar. So sort of gentle arm twisting that I should help out in the board. So I became the board of directors, got involved in the board of directors as the awards director. And I served there for 3 years. And then I was involved in several conferences around awards, co-chairs and chairing the conference. My last officially my last official engagement was, I think, the Montreal conference, where I was the awards chair in 2006. And then I took a little bit of a hiatus from my AMTEC involvement, direct involvement. I still went to some conferences, and I went to CADE as well. And then I got re-involved with the AMTEC Trust, which maybe we'll talk about a bit later, which is also kind of part of this project. So that's kind of my perspective in a nutshell. Cindy, did you want to?
Well, maybe I'll give a little bit of a background as to why we're doing this project. So a couple of years ago, Diane and I were both on the CNIE board. At the time, I was president. Diane, you, I think, were secretary treasurer at that time. And we were talking about the fact that we were coming up to the 50th anniversary of AMTEC. We hadn't done any research about this. The other thing that we were talking about at the time was that the AMTEC Trust Fund was just about to be depleted. In other words, we were going to award that year the last, or almost the last, AMTEC awards to projects and researchers in educational technology. So as we began to talk about that, and as Diane and I began to think about what happens when you leave a board where you've been a volunteer on and off or continually for, dozens of years almost, we thought that it might be worth telling the AMTEC story. And then as we moved through the next year or so, and we continued to explore a little bit more about the AMTEC history. And we didn't have very much information on the CNIE website. So we started to dig. We found some documents. We discovered that AMTEC history was buried in boxes and in archives at the National Archives of Canada, in fact. And we began to uncover the names of people who we knew, and who we didn't know some of, but we knew of, who were involved in AMTEC during its history. Somewhere along in here, we also discovered that AECT, the Association for Educational Communications and Technology in the US, was celebrating its 100th anniversary in 2023, and that the analogous association in, I think it's Australia, was also celebrating its 50th anniversary. So 2023 became a target deadline for us to pull as much of the history and documents and archives and thinking and memories together, and to make them available for people who might be interested in knowing more about educational technology and its history, its roots, and its developments in Canada over the course of the last 50 years. So that's what we've been doing. We've been interviewing memory keepers. We've been collecting and digitizing documents, and we are providing access to those documents through the CNIE website going forward. So that's a little bit of background anyway. Maybe others have more to offer.
No, I think that pretty much covers it, Cindy. It was kind of interesting to discover that 1973 was a major year for what I would classify as educational technology organizations. Australia started theirs, we started ours. Some things were happening in Europe at the same time. It seems that a lot of it was because of AECT. Certainly, a lot of the Canadians pre AMTEC and the organizations that existed from the 1950s until the early 1970s that formed AMTEC all seemed to meet at whatever conference was happening at AECT at the time. So it was really a catalyst for the Canadian side of the house. I think the other reason we wanted to do this was we recognized that the Canadian trajectory of educational technology was different than the American trajectory. Even today, AECT is a huge conference with massive numbers of folks. And I think that's one of the themes that came out of our interviews was how AECT was an amazing place to go and probably still is, although I think it's a couple of years since I've been to a conference there. But that AMTEC offered more of a community of practice concept to the folks across the country. I mean, we're a much larger country with a much more dispersed group of educational technologists and media specialists. So coming together was smaller, but more intimate, I think, was the feeling that I got from our memory keepers.
Yeah, that's kind of a theme that struck me all the way through. We've done 10 interviews now, was sort of the family feel that AMTEC had, and even some of the people interviewed sort of had this emotional connection to AMTEC and their time at AMTEC and the friends they made and the colleagues and all the interactions they had, which I'm not that familiar with ACET, but it definitely in Canadian context, AMTEC seemed to have created this across the country family where people who I think were in different regions, maybe a little bit isolated, were able to all collect together and share their experiences and their thoughts and socialize and network. And it seemed to have a huge impact on individuals who were involved.
I think that the faculty who supported their students to participate in AMTEC, so Diane Mary Kennedy, who we interviewed, Bob Bernard, in my case, who we interviewed, and some of the other faculty who've been mentioned by various memory keepers, and faculty themselves, like Rick Schwerer, for example, who was a faculty member who supported his students to participate in AMTEC. It was about growing the field, and the field was about the appropriate use of educational technology and media in the support of learning. And AMTEC's history crossed the country, but it also crossed the divides in terms of education. So higher education, college education, private sector education, K-12. There were members of AMTEC from across those fields, and the memory keepers that we've interviewed cross those fields as well. So we have perspectives about networking and friendliness and welcoming and supporting of students and research and thinking about and practice in educational technologies in Canada across the board. And that's part of what made it important to tell the story, I think. When we first got together with some of the folks that we've interviewed, some of the people who were involved in the early days at AMTEC, they said, you've got to do this. We've already lost some of our stories because people are getting older. And it's kind of important to, we think it's important to share these stories for the next generation of educational technologists and teachers.
Absolutely. And in fact, in some cases, the memory keepers that we talked to often were either Canadian and starting out their career, or came to Canada to start out their career and found themselves in as Chris called it, a community of like-minded folk who supported their careers. And so they, in turn, as you mentioned, started to support the careers of their students and so on. the other thing that was interesting about AMTEC, which I don't want to lose in the bigger conversation about sort of the faculty-student relationship, is how important it was in certain instances within the community affecting government decisions on media and technology in the country. I'm remembering, I think it was Ross that talked about the copyright issue, and there were other issues within Canada where AMTEC wrote position papers or wrote documents that were submitted to government oversee committees to sort of let them have a sense of the practitioner belief systems or concepts or research embedded evidence as to why the government should consider going in one direction over another. So it had an influence, and that may have been its time as well, sort of pre really strong internet and pre really sort of us being connected 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in our current world. In the early 70s and 80s, this would have been a lot less the case. And so we had a lot of thoughtful, reflective individuals who spent time creating arguments for government and private agencies to think about how educational technology and media should function in this sort of 20th century world that they found themselves in.
I'm not sure. One of the things I that also came up was the French English kind of not I don't know, collaborating is the right word, but there was definitely a sense from some of the people we talked to that not a sense of failure, but they weren't able to engage in that kind of across that divide, that language divide, and I also feel a bit of that. I know when we did the AMTEC conferences in Montreal, there was a very strong emphasis on making sure that they were bilingual, and to invite the francophones into the conference to do presentations. But I don't know, for whatever reason, it never really gelled across, I think, the 50-year lifespan of AMTEC and became part of the institution, the organization.
So here's there were other organizations in the country who were looking at exploration in the area that AMTEC members were. So CADE, for example, in distance education, CADE was extremely bilingual. And so there was, I think it may have attracted more francophones than AMTEC did. AMTEC did have a base in Montreal, absolutely. But there are extra steps in supporting a bilingual organization, translation services, editing in both languages and so on. And those who became involved in AMTEC did the best that they could with that. Mm-hmm. When it came time for AMTEC to disband in the early 2000s, the membership was beginning to decline. CADE's membership was also beginning to decline. And as technologies began to they began to converge, I guess. So media and technology, AMTEC's function, began to converge with distance education. And it made sense then that the two organizations should disband and create a new organization, which was called the Canadian Network for Innovation in Education, which was larger than either educational technology or distance education. Mm-hmm. CNIE is a bilingual organization as well. Although the board, when we were on it, Diane, didn't have any francophones on it. But for those of us who did work in both languages, and I was one of those, CADE seemed more the natural home. There are differences in how distance education is performed, Anglophone versus Francophone, or there were at the time as these things began to move forward. So some people might describe the AMTEC failure to be bilingual as a failure, but a linguistic failure or a cultural failure. But it was really the people who were there did the best they could with what was interesting to them. And the membership did represent the entire country, but the board not so much. And the activities not so much. The journal, the Journal of Education, no, CJEC, the Canadian Journal of Educational Communications, became the Canadian Journal of Learning Technology, which is the CNIE journal, and it is a bilingual journal. CJEC was not very much, although they did publish in French when they had the opportunity to. And CJLT does publish in French now. But the language culture issue was bigger than just what was going on in AMTEC, and AMTEC could not address some of the other things that were going on in the 70s and 80s between Quebec and the rest of the country too.
Well, and you also think about the fact that, I mean, Canada has often been described as the two solitudes. I mean, the difference between Upper and Lower Canada, the French versus the English, has always been strong. And even today, in the 21st century, we have a strong but still a fragile connection with our francophone compatriots. And so it's I think it is the history of Canada that has in many ways set up that particular situation. And as Cindy pointed out, I mean, as a student of history, the 70s and the 80s in Canada were volatile in terms of the politics between Canada and Quebec. And we were very close to seeing our country disintegrate because of it. So I think AMTEC was a product of its time, and that's really the interesting thing about it. I think as it moved into the 80s, the 90s, and the 2000s, it matured. 90s and 2000s, it matured, and I think started to see the benefit of sort of bringing folks together. But yes, the language issues, the gender issues, the some of the other intersectionality kinds of things that we're very aware of today were not necessarily well known or well considered when AMTEC started and into its middle years.
Can I just pick up on the gender issues? We did interview some women who said AMTEC was very friendly, whereas educational technology appears, at least on the outside, to be a male-dominated field. It turns out that on the application of the technology to practice, teaching and learning practice, not so much that's the case. And the women we have interviewed and our own experiences, I think, Diane, were that this was a friendly organization as compared to some others that we have had association with over the years. And that's a contribution of AMTEC for sure.
The other thing that I think we should probably talk about is the fact that AMTEC set the stage, along with CADE, Canadian Association of Distance Education, to bring educational technology and educational technologists into the 21st century. I think that we continue, even through our CNIE relationship, to look for ways of making a difference within the country, especially now in a situation where we can basically belong to anyone, anywhere. The most obscure educational technology group can find presence now because of the internet, because of social media technology that didn't exist back in the day. And so our younger educational technologists are often looking for that sense of community, which I think CNIE now brings to the table. Whereas previous to that, it was AMTEC and it was CADE who filled those gaps of community and knowledge, if you like.
Did you want me to say a few words about the AMTEC Trust? And maybe you guys can chip in too. It's actually the reason I think I got involved in this project was through my connections to you guys through the AMTEC Trust. And if you go to the CNIE website, there's more information there about the trust, but essentially it's a legacy left over from the merging of CADE with AMTEC to create the CNIE. There was a surplus of funds from AMTEC, and that fund, I guess they kind of sat there for a little while. It looks like at one point the AMTEC Trust was created. There were some funds distributed, and then it went into a bit of a hiatus again. And then I was asked to chair it in 2019, I think. And then we spent the next 3 years distributing the funds. There was about $30,000, maybe just over $30,000. And in the last 3 years, we distributed it to 10 individuals who were using the money for professional development, some students using it for research purposes. And we have essentially drained that fund now, so that to the benefit of these individuals. So that's kind of a quick and short history of the AMTEC Trust. And I suppose it's the last remnants of AMTEC that is still active. So, and now with this folding, I think this history project we're working on and the building of the website and these interviews with the memory keepers is going to be part of that legacy of AMTEC as well.
The thing about the trust is that AMTEC had a history, according to the documents, of giving awards for appropriate use of various technologies. Some of those awards were private sector funded. There was a Sony award and a Panasonic award for the use of film in the classroom or video in the classroom or something. That predates me. But according to the documents, that's what we see. And what I know about the AMTEC Trust was that many of the recipients, or let's say the applicants, were students or were young faculty looking for funding to do the work, the research in many cases, or the evaluations of innovative applications of these technologies for the benefit of getting their dissertation or getting their master's degree or getting tenure or whatever. So it was a professional development, as you said, Chris, opportunity for people. And we did give on the language issue, we did give several awards in my time on the trust to Francophones. Those faculty who were recipients, as insofar as I know, many of them supported their graduate students after they got that trust because and then encouraged them to apply for awards themselves. I can think of a case where somebody won an award as a student who went on to become a faculty member, and then her student applied and was an award winner. So there was a kind of a legacy there and some evidence of ongoing support. There was also a condition on award winners that they were required to present at the next CNIE conference the results of whatever it was that was funded, whether it was an exploration, an investigation, or a proof of concept or the development of a tool or whatever. They were required to present at future CNIE conferences so that legacy was built in. In recent years, we didn't have that quite so much, partly because of COVID maybe, but we did require people to do a little self-video, a self-portrait of their project. And so those are also available on the CNIE website for those that we got anyhow.
Well, and I should put out the fact that I was one of the AMTEC Trust Award winners. In fact, in the last year that AMTEC gave out these awards, the AMTEC Trust gave out these awards. So showing my bias is not the right word, but showing my connection to the process. And it's interesting because as a young graduate student, one of the things that I found really most effective in terms of the AMTEC project the AMTEC organization and the trust was the opportunity to be part of the adjudication panel. They encouraged young faculty, young graduate students to be part of the adjudication process, which allowed you to see the work that was happening across the country, so that even if you were, in my case, in St. John's, Newfoundland, or in British Columbia, where I moved to afterwards, it allowed me to see what was happening in Saskatchewan, what was happening in Montreal, what was happening in PEI, because you found all of these amazing people doing this really, cutting edge work, which you would never have known about under any other circumstances other than to be able to adjudicate the work that was happening. So it was an experience, and I think it's one that's missing to some extent today in a lot of our digital organizations. We can belong to a lot of organizations, but it takes a much larger effort to be part of the inner workings. Whereas I found with AMTEC, sort of once somebody discovered that you had an interest in being part of the awards committee, for example, and Chris's leadership in this area. I mean, once he found out that you were interested, he always made sure that you had opportunities to adjudicate and explore year after year. So it really opened up the opportunities for younger graduate students to pay attention to what was happening in their worlds outside of themselves.
Yeah, I always found that, I was often involved in the awards committees and such, but to me, a lot of the value of AMTEC was going to these smaller communities like Lethbridge and such, Saskatoon. They're smaller communities, but it was an opportunity to see what these communities were doing, these educational communities were doing. I suppose with today, with the internet and social media, maybe there isn't that kind of isolation, but I remember going to some of the presentations and they're from like First Nations communities, and it's like, wow, they were really doing some interesting work, and I don't think if I had not gone to the conference in Saskatoon, I would have never had that opportunity to see the incredible work that these people were doing to reach out to communities that were isolated, that were probably had fewer resources, to say the least. So it was pretty amazing to have that opportunity to see that happening.
And I was just going to say, and that's something that hallmarked AMTEC, was the willingness to go to for the conference to go to smaller venues. Yeah. It wasn't just Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal, but you could find yourself in St. John's, Newfoundland, or you could find yourself in, as you said, Saskatoon. And these are areas that one goes through on the way to somewhere else sometimes. Having lived in Saskatoon, it's a lovely city, but sometimes you need a conference to attract folks to come and really see how beautiful it is, and to see the innovation that's happening in that university and in that K-12 system.
So there's two things about that. There's the learning that as a conference goer you get by attending these activities or reading the journal or participating in some of the board related stuff. There's the learning, but the other piece is the friendliness, the networking, and the exposure to the fact that somebody at some other part of the country is facing not only the same opportunities as you, but the same challenges, and maybe most importantly, the same challenges. Mm-hmm. So they might have found a solution, like I can think of one, a collaboration with a public library, which is something I learned about from a conference that I would never have thought of on my own. So this exposure to alternative, innovative, unusual, non-traditional ways of thinking about and using media or technology in the classroom was just a real part of the legacy. And I'm not saying that other organizations don't or haven't done that, but there was something about it being accessible. It was small enough. I think some of our memory keepers mentioned this too. The community was so small that people had access to and were accepted by its membership in ways that might not have happened in other kinds of organizations.
I can remember as a grad student going to conferences, and the people who wrote the papers that I was reading were there and sitting at the same dinner table, having the same chat and leaning over and saying, so what do you do? And how long have you been involved? And what kinds of projects are you working on? And it was a little bit like, fangirl, starstruck kind of things happening. And that continued for me when I moved to Vancouver, because of course I got to work with Tony Bates, and people from all over the world would just show up on Tony's doorstep wanting to sort of chat with him. So it was one of those things that AMTEC started in my home province, which then continued into my career of actually getting to meet the people who are writing the things that were amazing to me, and the thought pieces that really changed the way I view technology, distance learning, e-learning, and so on. So it's kind of cool as a young grad student to walk into a room and see the named author willing to talk to you as a person, as opposed to sort of being distant, literally.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I mean, have we sort of covered where we think this might be going? I mean, one of the things we haven't chatted about is the fact that CNIE has graciously set up our AMTEC history page. So we do have that under construction. We are, I think Cindy in your introduction mentioned that we were digitizing as much as we can. We've put out a call to our former members because as they start to retire, my thinking is they're going to find artifacts that have been sort of buried in their offices for a number of years, if not decades, and hopefully they'll be able to send us some digital versions of that. The other thing I think to mention is that we do have an article that's being published, hopefully sometime in 2023, as part of that AECT 100-year celebration. What we did was we co-wrote an article on the history of AMTEC and how it was influenced by AECT, how it came to be, because Canadians would go to the AECT conference and talk about how are we going to make something similar happen in Canada. So we've got still some irons in the fire, even though I'm guessing that we're probably looking to have the project probably wind up in towards the end of 2023, early 24.
I think it's fair to say we would continue to interview memory keepers who identify themselves to us, and so we are available and interested in that. I guess the second thing is on the article. You mentioned AECT, and it's it's important perhaps to some to announce that or to remind us all that AECT and CNIE still have a collaborative relationship, which allows AECT members, Americans, to go to CNIE conferences and the reverse. So there are still links between those two organizations, and there are certainly educational technologists whose allegiance is to the larger American conference for academic reasons or whatever. So those links still continue to exist. And while Chris and Diane and I may be winding down our part of this, this is a living project which is open to anybody to continue and extend and collaborate on.
And part of the reason we did this was because we wanted young and historically inclined educational technologists or folks who write about the history of EdTech to have a source of some of the voices that made AMTEC and media in technology in Canada prominent. You know, from the late 1950s up until present day, basically. And to give folks an opportunity to hear those voices in situ, so that we didn't lose the memories that these keepers have.
And I have to say, I'm disappointed we did not solve the mystery of the AMTEC quilt. So this will be for some future historically inclined, as you said, Diane, educational technologist to solve. So I'm not sure. We will continue, I think, as Cindy said, follow up with people who want to be interviewed as part of the Memory Keeper series. And who knows, maybe it will get resolved. Maybe we can post it on the CNIE website and offer a huge reward.
And if anybody's watching this and they have memories of AMTEC and we haven't reached out to you yet, just be in touch. Either by sending an email directly to CNIE and they'll put you in touch with us. But Cindy's at Athabasca, Chris is UBC, I'm at Thompson Rivers. We're not hard to find. Just Google us and you'll be able to find an email or a phone number or any way that you wish to get in touch. So yes, I think you're right that we are definitely open to keeping this project going as much as possible. And making sure that future generations have heard the voices.
So I guess that's probably it. We want to thank you for watching, if that's what you've been doing, and for your interest in AMTEC and the history of educational technology in Canada. And let me just take this opportunity to thank Diane and Chris for the wonderful opportunity to work together. It's been a blast, really.
I can't think of a better team than the three of us. Chris and Cindy makes this team really easy to work with and work for. So I'm thrilled that I got a chance to do this.
Yeah, I want to say exactly the same thing. It's been a pleasure. It's been fun. It's been enlightening, informative, whatever. It's all been a very, very interesting project. And I do hope that we can carry on for the next few months and maybe add a bit more to this series, and maybe who knows what we'll find out. But it has been an interesting voyage of discovery, and I appreciate having the opportunity to work with you guys.